Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Pawan, and the reason why I'm starting this series is to just teach what I know about science to all of you because I'm really passionate about the subject and I've been passionate about it for as long as I can remember, ever since I was young, just studying about it. So my goal is to share with all of you all the knowledge that I have on science from middle school, including high school, and maybe even university level once we get to that point. Though at university, I will be more specialized in my knowledge. But anyways, all of the science that I will be covering will be to do with biology, chemistry, and physics. And I hope that by the end of this, you will have the same amount of knowledge and a really good repertoire of how to understand the world a lot better, right? And since this is the first episode, I think I'd like to start by just explaining what science itself is about. So, in a lot of these, I will try to avoid, wherever possible, controversial topics such as politics and religion and so on. But a lot of my focus will be primarily on science, so I don't intend to offend anyone. The purpose of this is just to talk primarily about science, not really anything else, and really just to improve your knowledge. So, firstly, since this is the first session, let's firstly talk about what science actually is. Okay. Now, when I say the word science, or when anyone does, majority of people think that science might be the antithesis towards religion, right? That science is like the opposite of religion in a sense, right? Now, that's not exactly true. Science on its own is a method to study and understand the world. That's what science actually is. It's a methodology, right? And it has a bunch of assumptions behind it. But again, the entire point of science is to be able to verify truth claims. So again, science is a method to study and understand the world around us. But in a more abstract concept, it is essentially just used to investigate and verify truth claims. Okay, so what is a truth claim? Well, a truth claim is any kind of claim that can be tested and can be, I suppose, fact checked, right? So, for example, I could make a claim that majority of people have 5 fingers on their hands. And one way to investigate that claim is to collect a bunch of people on random and to then check whether those people do in fact have on average 5 people, or sorry, 5 fingers, right? But that's not always going to be the case because you do have people that have polydactyly, which is a condition where they might have 6 fingers, or you might have people who have lost a finger, in which case they'd have 4 fingers instead, right? And that leads to one of the important things about science, which is to do with its practical limitations of investigations. So, for example, one of the issues with science is that for any scientific experiment that we are conducting, the more trials we have, the more reliability we have in that data. And the other thing that adds to that reliability is the sample size. Okay, by trials, I'm talking about how many repeats we have. Okay, so for example, you might have an experiment that you have in mind to perform, and that experiment could be repeated a numerous amount of times. Another thing that you could do to increase reliability is to just use a higher sample size. This is not always applicable. There are some cases where it can't really be applied in science, but usually when you're talking about stuff like biology, that you can use things like samples. For example, in ecology, if you're trying to investigate how many butterflies there are in a particular park, you might want to use multiple nets to then figure out what is the average between all those nets, right? And that can again increase the reliability of your results. But that's not the only thing that science is about. The other thing that science is about transparency, which is why in science we normally want to outline what procedures or methods we are conducting. Okay, the entire point about science is to be open to change and to be open to the fact that you might be wrong. And it's not necessarily that you might be wrong, but the conclusion itself might be wrong. So science is supposed to be a method that's very objective in a sense, that itself, that science itself, doesn't care about what you feel or what you think. It's more so about whether that claim is true or false and whether there's evidence supporting that claim. That's the entirety of how science works. And this then relates to one more point as well with truth claims, which is just to do with something called unfalsifiability. Or falsifiability. Okay, so let me explain what this is. So when we're talking about science, science is only capable of investigating claims that are falsifiable. In a nutshell, what this basically means is that we can only really be combating or investigating claims that can be proven true or false. So let me give you an example of a falsifiable claim, and let me give you an example of an unfalsifiable claim. An example of a falsifiable claim would be the claim that I've got 5 fingers on my hand. I could show you my hand and you could check for yourself whether it's got 5 fingers or not. Now, for an falsifiable claim, that would be a claim where I could make a claim that you would in no way be able to test and verify. So let me give you an example of an unfalsifiable claim. That would be something like every second when you're not looking around behind yourself, there is an invisible fairy. And the moment you look behind yourself to try and look at this invisible fairy, they actually completely disappear from the universe. And the moment you look away again, they reappear and they are there. But again, once you turn around, they disappear. They're no longer there. And there's no way for you to actually detect and check this fairy actually exists. Now, that's an example of an unfalsifiable claim. And it's an unfalsifiable claim because we can't actually test whether that quote-unquote fairy exists or not. Right? So a lot of the science that we're going to be talking about, because we're dealing with biology, chemistry, and physics, these will be topics that are very concrete, right? Concrete. There's not much abstractualization. There's not much philosophy behind them in a sense, right? So I will be dealing with concepts that are very grounded and are falsifiable as a result. Okay. Now, with that said, there is one more point as well, which is just another point I think I'll just mention really quickly. With science, science is always iterative or procedural. Okay, what this basically means is that whenever you form a conclusion or a hypothesis or a claim in science, that claim can be debunked in the future and it can be improved upon. Okay, so science is an iterative process. And there are really, really good examples of this that you're going to see in, once we cover chemistry, you're going to see a really good example of this. But there are examples like this all over the place in science. Let me just try and give you a good example right now. I suppose germ theory is one of them, right? So in biology, for example, once upon a time, people had believed that diseases were caused by the levels of fluids in the body varying. Right? You had what they called darker fluids and red fluids and yellow fluids, which they actually called dark bile, yellow bile, and red bile, I believe. And what they believed back then was that if these biles were in different amounts, then the person would get sick. So what they used to do is when people got sick with the cold, they would drain a person's blood because that was their idea of red bile. Maybe they thought that the person had too much red bile, right? Now that's been debunked, and we've got a better theory of disease instead, which is germ theory, that disease is actually caused by these invisible, tiny, microscopic germs, right? And we can falsify this claim as well, because you can actually look under a microscope to see whether this is true or false. And there are other experiments you can do as well. But the point anyways is that we once had an original claim, and that claim gets improved and improved and improved with trial and error. And as more evidence comes to light, we tend to pick the claim that has more evidence backing it up. So all the claims that we have today, all the things that we believe that are true today, one day in the future, they might not be true anymore. And the only way that science will make progress is by the debunking of claims, right? In terms of science, we can't make any progress if we're stagnating, if we believe that one thing is always true. So science is entirely about trying to disprove previous results and trying to improve upon getting better and clearer claims. That also leads to something else, which is just peer review. Okay, and this really links towards transparency or outlining the procedure and the method. One of the reasons why you want to outline the procedures and the methods of any of your experiments is because you want to enable other people to scrutinize your working. Okay, peer review. So peer just means your friends. Review means they're having a look at what you're doing. Peer review is just a concept where once you've published your experiment, you allow other people to repeat your experiment to verify whether they get the same data as you have or not. And that will allow them to essentially check whether whether it was just luck as to how you got your results, or whether, for example, maybe you were trying to cheat your results, right? But again, this is what science is about. It's about holding yourself accountable, holding yourself transparent, and treating everyone to the same amount of rigor that you treat yourself. That is what science is about. So, with that said, I'm just going to move on to what are the three main sciences that we're going to be studying. Okay. Now, remember that science itself is just a method to investigate and understand the world. It's a methodology, right? And therefore, any area of study counts as a science, right? So you could, for example, have the life sciences, which is biology. You could have the physical sciences, which is physics. You could have the science about chemical reactants, which we can call chemistry, right? And again, I'm going to talk about just biology, chemistry, and physics, but you've got many different sciences out there, like geography, which is the study of how the earth works and how weather can fluctuate. It's involves a lot of other things as well. It's a really big umbrella term. You've got psychology, which is the study of how the mind works, which is a subset of biology. And you've got sociology, which is the study of society and different class structures and so on, right? But either way, whenever you're dealing with the study of basically anything, there's always a science involved. So science is just a method that will nest itself into wherever it's appropriate to do so. All right, so moving on with science, we're going to talk about the three main sciences that I'd like to share with all of you, which is biology, chemistry, and physics. Okay, now bio just means life. Logy means study. So biology is the branch of science that deals with the study of life. Right, so the branch of science that deals with study of life. So in biology, we tackle questions like, what does it mean to be considered alive, right? Or maybe that's more philosophical. Maybe a better way for me to rephrase it is more so, what are the characteristics to which you would call something alive or not alive, right? What is happening inside an organism to cause it to be alive in a sense, right? How do different organisms interact with each other, you know? And what do organisms do to keep themselves alive? Those are some of the questions that biology deals with, and it also deals with the enormous classification of different kinds of life. For example, you've got animals, you've got plants, you've got fungi, you've got viruses, you've got bacteria, you've got protoctista, and they have even more groupings underneath all of them. That's what biology deals with. Now, chemistry is the branch of science that deals with chemicals and their reactions. Okay, so this is also enormous of itself. So when we're talking about chemicals, this is essentially any kind of molecule or compound or element, which you learn more about as we go through it. But essentially, what are the properties of different materials? Why do some materials react really vigorously while some don't? And what makes materials different from each other, right? These are the kinds of questions that chemistry deal with. I think it was in Breaking Bad, Walter White, what he defined chemistry as was the study of change, right? That's how he defined it as. And in a sense, he's partially right, because that again is just to do with how materials change over time, and why do some materials change very quickly, in a sense, compared to other materials. Again, that's what chemistry deals with. And physics, which is essentially my specialty, that is the study of the physical world, or the branch of science that deals with the study of the physical world. Okay, now this is opposed to metaphysics. Okay, so metaphysics is more to do with philosophy and abstractualization. So for example, metaphysics would tackle questions like what is considered art, whereas physics is to do with the concrete study of the physical world. So for example, why am I able to hold this pen in this way and my fingers don't phase into the pen? Why does this pen drop when I let go of it? What speed does it drop at? Can I calculate exactly when it'll hit the ground? What are the different forces acting on an object? What is a force? These kinds of questions are what physics deals with, right? Now, one other thing as well that I'd like to dispel is that a lot of people have this notion of having a preference of one subject over the other. Some people say that they really like biology, and some people say that they really like chemistry, and some people say that they really like physics. I've never really understood that as much because biology, chemistry, and physics are three sciences that are always interrelated with each other. For instance, to understand what is going on inside biology, you need to understand that all of life is made up of chemicals. Therefore, if you understand chemistry, there's a huge link towards biology as well. Now, with how these chemicals themselves behave on an atomic level, that is governed by the laws of physics. Therefore, physics also has a big link towards chemistry. So, physics, chemistry, and biology are all interrelated at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, essentially. So, the knowledge that you gain in biology will also help you with your knowledge in chemistry and will also help you with your knowledge in physics. And I definitely found this being true for myself when I was studying biology, chemistry, and physics when I was younger. Um, I did find that a lot of concepts that I've learned about in biology complemented my understanding of chemistry as well as in physics and so on, right? But either way, these are the three sciences that we're going to be talking about in the entirety of this series here. So just to give you a bit of an introduction. Okay, sorry about that. I was just drinking some water. But just to give you a bit of an introduction, right? Once again, biology, chemistry, and physics. I'm going to be starting with middle school level first. And once we get it out of the way, then we move on to high school. Some of you might find the middle school level boring in a sense, but that is what is required for you to have the foundation needed to understand high school. If you ask me, high school is where it gets super, super interesting. But again, having that foundation knowledge in middle school is quite important towards being able to understand what's going to happen later on in all of these sciences. Okay, so here are a few terms that will help you understand the language of science before we get into the actual nitty-gritty. These are some terms that I think are important just for us to go through. So the most famous one, if you ask me, is what a hypothesis actually is. Now, I believe this comes from Latin, but hypo just means less or little, and thesis just means a claim, or it means knowledge. Okay, so a hypothesis is a claim that does not necessarily have a lot of evidence behind it. It is a claim that may be unsubstantiated by knowledge or by evidence. Okay, so there might not be enough evidence for this claim. So for example, again, I could make up the hypothesis that majority of people have 5 fingers on their hand on average, right? So this could be my hypothesis. Now, obviously, you and I know that that should be true, right? But again, science is not about just assuming the obvious. It is about making a hypothesis and then claiming or then experimenting to see whether that hypothesis is true or not, right? So once we formulate a hypothesis, we devise an experiment to test the hypothesis. Well, of course, in this silly example that I've made, that would be something like collecting 10 random people. We want it to be random so that we are preventing bias, because we want to try and be transparent. But either way, we collect 10 random people, and then what we do is we count their fingers, and then we calculate the average. Okay, and based on the results of the experiment, we then verify to see whether it agrees with the hypothesis or not. So we check to see if it agrees with the hypothesis or not. And essentially, if it doesn't, then we formulate a new hypothesis, a new better hypothesis. And the new hypothesis that you make needs to be able to explain the results. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it needs to be able to fit or explain the results. So, for example, you could make a hypothesis that says something like, okay, so, well, in this case, we don't have to reformulate our hypothesis. But for example, if my hypothesis was that majority of people have 4 fingers in their hand, and then if we devised an experiment, and then from that we saw that it was actually 5, then I would make a new hypothesis instead. I would scrap the old one. I would reject the previous hypothesis, and I'd make a new one, right? But we can go further. So, for example, science is about trying to scrutinize even further what's beneath the claim, right? So you could ask the question of why do 5 people, or why do people have 5 fingers exactly on each hand? Is there ever a case where that's not the case? Is there a deeper reason as to why? And we could make a hypothesis to explain this. For example, I could say something like, people have 5 fingers because it helps them grip better onto surfaces. Okay, so maybe again I could make the claim that it helps grip onto surfaces. Okay, so again, my new hypothesis right now is that people have 5 fingers so that they can grip onto surfaces more easily. But if that was the case, then you would expect people with more fingers to be, what do you call it, rock climbers or those mountain climbers, for example, right? So is it the case that people got 5 fingers in order to help them grip onto surfaces, if that makes sense, right? So just to clarify what I mean, okay, what I'm trying to claim here is I'm trying to claim that the grip is what causes people to have 5 fingers, okay? But we know that's not necessarily true because people are born with 5 fingers. So there's a much deeper reason as to why people actually have 5 fingers. But this is an example of how you can disprove this particular hypothesis here by testing a bunch of mountain climbers, for example, right? So again, this can be proven false because what we see is that the incidence of how many fingers someone has doesn't correlate with whether they're mountain climbers or not, right? So there might be something else that's explaining it. And really, it turns out that there is. It turns out that what's actually causing the amount of fingers that we have is the genetic code that we're based off of, right? Which we will go into in more detail later on. But again, this is just an example of how you could make an original hypothesis, devise an experiment to check if that hypothesis is true or false, and then make a new hypothesis that fits that data. Okay, and again, science is entirely full of stuff like this. A lot of revolutionary theories have been made using this exact method. Okay, now with that said, there's another keyword that has a lot of misconceptions I think we need to address, which is theory. Okay, now in normal English, a theory, or just theory, means it's theoretical. It means that it's imaginative. It means that there's no evidence behind it. That's what it means in normal English. Okay. Now, in the language of science, a theory is a claim that has an immense amount of evidence behind it. So, a little confusing, but that's what a theory actually is. A theory is a claim in science, or an idea in science, with an ample amount of evidence behind it. So essentially, for any theory, or if we are ever bestowing something in science with the title of theory, it's a great honor in a sense, right? Because it means that it's been given a lot of evidence and it's very hard to debunk. Okay, so an example of a theory in science would be quantum theory. That would be in physics. Another one is Einstein's theory of general relativity. We also have Darwin's, from biology, theory of evolution. And we also have in chemistry, the particle theory or the kinetic theory of matter. Again, you will learn about what all of these are as I go through them later on. Maybe not the two top ones just yet, but we will come across them at some point. Either way, what I wanted to emphasize here was the misconception. So for instance, some people might look at Darwin's theory of evolution and they might think that the theory of evolution just means that evolution is just a theory, that it has no evidence behind it. But remember again, science, the language of science is a little confusing, right? When I'm talking about the word theory here, what I actually mean is that it has a lot of evidence behind it. And in terms of Darwin's theory of evolution or evolutionary theory, it does have a lot of evidence behind it. And that's the same with the particle theory of matter, that it has a lot of evidence behind it, as well as the theory of general relativity, that it has a lot of evidence behind it. So again, if something doesn't have that much evidence behind it, we would call it a hypothesis, right? So hypothesis. If something has a lot of evidence behind it at that point, we don't call it a hypothesis, we instead call it a theory, right? So it's a theory that collates a lot of different facts together to substantiate this really huge claim. So just keep that in mind, right? Now, it's important to recognize as well that when you're practicing science, it's very important to try and be unbiased, right? So remember that science itself doesn't care about what you think. It is more so to do with what the facts are. Okay, so it's like Ben Shapiro saying that facts don't care about your feelings, right? But in a sense, what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's more so that science is trying to inculcate your critical thinking, right? Which just means challenging your biases, okay? And asking why, right? So questioning, okay? And being open to change. Well, within good reason, of course. You'd want the evidence to actually look at whether you should be changing yourself or not. But anyways, as I was saying, right, science is all about trying to inculcate this kind of critical thinking. And I'm just going to give you another example just to show you what I mean, right? So here is an example of a fallacy. Okay, now this is more to do with logic, but it'll help illustrate why this manner of critical thinking is really important for you to try and be mindful of as you're studying this. Okay, so this is a type of a fallacy is just a logical mistake. That's what you could call it. All right, and there's many different kinds of fallacies out there. There's, for example, this ad hominem, there's ad populum, a lot of different ones. I'm not going to go into that right now because we're not studying debating. Okay, but I am going to talk about a particular fallacy that's called the correlation causation fallacy. Now, I really wish I had learned about this sooner, because I only learned about this when I was in high school. I never learned about it when I was in middle school. But I think it's super, super interesting. So, the correlation causation fallacy, in case you don't know what correlation means, a correlation is when you notice a pattern between two things. Okay, so again, a correlation is when you know there's a pattern between two things. And a causation is when you try to claim that there's a link between them. Okay, so let me give you an example. We could have the risk of cancer here on this axis on the graph, and on the other axis we could have the number of cigarettes smoked. So evidently, and I hope you'll all agree, that essentially the more cigarettes you smoke, the higher your risk of cancer. Okay, and you can fact check this as well, I suppose. But this is what it might look like. If I plot a graph where I've asked multiple people to tell me whether they have cancer or not, and I ask them how much they smoke, maybe in terms of lung cancer, this is what the graph might look like. So we'd see this kind of spread here, and generally speaking, we'd see this kind of line of best fit, right? Where it looks like it's showing a positive correlation. Okay, that is to say that if the number of cigars increases, then the risk of cancer increases. Okay, now be very mindful. That's not me saying that as the number of cigars you smoke increases, then your risk of cancer increases. That's not me saying that. From this graph, all I can conclude is that if a person smokes more cigars, then they're likelier to have a higher risk of cancer. Whether it's the case that the number of cigars causes them to have cancer, that's still up to debate. That's still up to being proved. Okay? So let me give you another example of this. Maybe this will drive the point home. And this was exactly how I learned it in class. So if we have another graph here, let's say that this graph over here was to do with the number of shark attacks on a day. And this over here was to do with the amount of ice cream sold. Okay, so again, we have the number of shark attacks in one day, and then we have the amount of ice cream sold in one day. If you try to track this yourself across any country, what you will see is that it shows a positive correlation. Okay, and does this mean that we should stop selling ice cream so that the number of shark attacks will decrease and more people don't die from shark attacks? So you have to think really carefully about this, whether that's the case or not, right? What actually is the cause between both of these variables in this case? So in this particular case, it is not actually the case that eating more ice cream causes you to see more shark attacks out there. It is more so the case that it's actually the weather that influences both of these. It's a third variable entirely, right? So that is to say, if the weather is really hot, then the amount of ice cream sold in that day is going to increase because people are wanting a cool snack to cool them down. And at the same time, on a hot day, people are also likelier to actually go to the beach. And therefore, the incidence of reported shark attacks will increase. This is actually what's going on over here, right? But again, the third variable in this case is just the weather. Right, so the hot weather is what's influencing both of these to appear like they're linked. Okay, now this is a really good example of the correlation causation fallacy, because someone who is naive might look at this and might think, okay, I should no longer eat ice cream because I don't want to get eaten by a shark. But no, it's more so the fact that you should be careful when you're swimming in a beach. That's really what this is showing us, right? And you could get these kinds of graphs from anything. Okay, so essentially, as part of critical thinking, when you spot a pattern, whether it's science or not, you have to always be careful about what's causing it, right? Have you proven for sure that there's a causal link between these two variables, or is it just a coincidental pattern, or is there a third factor behind them that's actually puppeting both of them, makes it look like they're related? So in other words, if I showed you this graph over here and I asked you whether this graph was evidence that smoking causes cancer, you should tell me that it's not actually evidence that smoking causes cancer. I'm not trying to say that smoking doesn't cause cancer. In fact, according to the scientific literature, it obviously does. But you cannot conclude that from this graph alone. That's the key point. If I show you this graph of, whether or not smoking, and I ask you, does smoking cause cancer? From this graph, you cannot conclude whether it does cause cancer. To figure out whether it does cause cancer for sure, you actually need to investigate the biology and the chemicals of what's going on inside the body with cigarettes. If you investigate that and you find a causal link, like an exact biological pathway, right, then you can conclude that smoking causes cancer. But otherwise, the only conclusion that you can draw here is that as the number of cigarettes smoked increases, the risk of cancer is likelier, right? That's what it appears to look like. It's not that one causes the other, it's just that we can notice this kind of coincidental pattern between them, right? Now, the last thing that we'll just talk about for this session is just what variables are, as well as data, okay? So in any experiment, there's always data that we are trying to investigate. I've shown you some examples of data just now, where we were talking about the number of fingers, for example, the number of sharks, I suppose, the amount of ice cream. That's all kind of data, right? So we have two kinds of data, that is quantitative and qualitative. Now, when we're talking about qualitative data, this is data that is subjective in a sense. Okay, so this is data that is not numerical. And it's a lot more harder to analyze this kind of data here. So if we are dealing with just science on its own, we want to try and deal with quantitative data. This is data that's numerical. And therefore it is more objective and it is easier to analyze. So as you can see from the example that I gave you earlier, the graphs that I drew as well, these are all numbers, right? So there's a big aspect of data analysis in science that maybe at some point we'll cover. That's not really the main focus of this, but just keep in mind that interpreting the results and verifying whether that data is accurate or not, or whether it's reliable or not, that's also a really big part of science. So again, having that critical thinking of not just blindly believing someone's new hypothesis, but looking at their data to see if they've collected their data from an unbiased sample, for example, all that is a really big part of science, right? Now, with variables, these over here come in different types. A variable is a type of data. So again, I've given you different examples of variables, which was, for example, we had one variable was the number of fingers, I suppose, and another variable that was what? The number of sharks and so on, right? These are examples of variables. These are things that we can measure, all right? We've got two kinds of variables. We have something that we call an independent variable and a dependent variable, which I will just link over here. We have a few more as well. For example, I'll just link one right here. We have something that's called a control variable too. So very quickly, just to summarize, an independent variable is the variable that we are controlling in an experiment. So we have full control over this and varying this, usually in regular increments to try and spot if there's any pattern. So for example, what's a classic kind of experiment? I could say something like, the more sunlight I expose a plant to, the more it's going to grow. So in that case, my independent variable could be time, right? Maybe I could give a plant only 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours of sunlight a day. And then the dependent variable in that case, if I'm trying to grow the plant, I would need to measure its height before and after. So the dependent variable would be the change in height. Okay, so this dependent variable is actually what we are investigating. Right? So in the case of that plant experiment that I gave you just now, we are varying how much that plant is being subjected to some amount of light, and we are then investigating how much that plant's height has changed because of the light that has affected it, right? So that again is an example of an independent variable and a dependent variable. What's important for you to keep in mind is that when you're trying to formulate any kind of experiment, you always want to minimize how many variables you're experimenting, or how many variables you are including in your experiment and how much you are varying. It's always good practice to try and include just one independent variable and one dependent variable. Otherwise, the experiment is going to become too complicated and your hypothesis or your claim at the end is not going to be that clear, I suppose, right? So again, you want to make sure that your independent variables and your dependent variables are concise and just singular. That is usually what defines a good experiment or a more clear experiment. Now, a control variable, as I mentioned, right, there are many variables out there. For example, in the experiment for a plant, if I had a plant in a pot and I was changing the time it took for it to be subjected to some amount of sunlight, and then I was measuring what its change in height was, there's a lot of different control variables. So there's a lot of different variables out there that I don't necessarily control, or I'll try to control, okay? So again, the variable that I'm controlling is the duration of sunlight. The variable that I'm measuring is the height of the plant. But there are other variables out there, like the amount of nutrients in the soil, or the concentration of oxygen in the air, or the amount of water that I'm giving the plant. Those are all examples of other variables in the experiment. So to prevent those variables from influencing the results of this experiment, you have to try and control those variables. That's what we call a control variable. You will see this having way more impact in biology and chemistry than you will in physics, because physics tends to be a lot more drier. It tends to be a lot more easier to conduct experiments in physics, relatively speaking, compared to biology. But either way, in biology, or in all the three sciences, we want to try and make sure that we keep these control variables in check. So in this case, the control variable is, again, the external factors that we are keeping in check. So the external factors we keep constant so that they don't influence what the results of the experiment are going to be, right? And again, in this case, the example that I just gave you was the amount of O2 in the air, so the O2 percentage in air, or maybe the CO2 percentage, or maybe it's the water in the soil, the H2O in the soil, or maybe it is the nutrients in the soil, so the minerals present in the soil. Okay, or maybe it's the amount of soil, or maybe it's even the type of plant, right? So to make an experiment as far as possible, you want to try and make sure that you have one independent variable, and that all the control variables that you can think of are controlled as far as reasonably possible, okay? That doesn't mean that this is always going to be possible. It's always going to be practical limitations, but this is what good scientific practice looks like. And if there ever is a case where you notice that there's a control variable that you can't take into account, you have to always declare this at the end of your experiment. All right, so that is essentially the end of this session, right? So I hope that from doing this, you will have a bigger understanding, a more wider understanding of what science is about, right? But just to summarize again, remember that science is a method, right? It's a scientific method, that's what we call it, but science itself is a method to help pursue what is the truth of a claim. And it can only be effective for claims that are falsifiable and claims that are repeatable, meaning that other people can also test those claims to see whether that claim will be true or false, right? But that is the kind of claims that science will deal with. Any other kinds of claims that are made, science can't do anything about it. That's like the drawback of it, I suppose, right? But again, the strong point about science is that we judge things based on the evidence and whether it's supported by evidence. And if something doesn't have evidence behind it, then it's not scientifically backed. Yeah, so for the next session, what I will do is I'll try to go through more topics in specifically biology, chemistry, and physics, and we'll try to alternate through it. So again, we'll start with just the middle school level, and then we will progress on to high school once we are done with the middle school level. But yeah, thank you for watching, and let me know if there's any questions.